Okay, it is 1 o'clock here. Sorry, we don't have a big show open for something like this. This is the land of Zoom. This is what the pandemic has brought us, but here we are. My name's Glenn Farley. I'm the aerospace reporter for King 5 News here in Seattle. And this is the independent aerospace analyst panel looking at the future of Boeing and U.S. aerospace. I want to thank the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers, District 751, for providing the Zoom platform for this. This will also be carried over TBW, which is Washington's cable channel, and it will be in the archives there as well. The machinists have asked for an objective, an independent view of where this industry is heading, and we will provide that. So I will keep this moving along as the moderator. I want to introduce our panelists. One of them is missing right now. We hope he catches up. But first of all, Richard Aboulafia, Vice President of Analysis at the Teal Group outside of Washington, D.C. and Fairfax, Virginia. He manages consulting projects in the commercial and military aircraft field and analyzes broader defense and aerospace trends. He's advised numerous aerospace companies and in recent years produced the 2018 and 2019 Aerospace Competitive Economic Study looking at state competitiveness. We also have Dr. Kevin Michaels. He's managing director of Aerodynamic Advisory, a specialized consulting firm focused on the global aerospace and aviation industries. He is a globally recognized expert in the aerospace manufacturing and maintenance, repair, and overhaul sectors for 34 years. We have a third panelist. This is Zoom, so who knows what has gone a little awry in terms of getting into the system, but that is Ron Epstein, Managing Director in Equity Research at Bank of America Merrill Lynch, covering aerospace, defense, and companies with large aerospace components. He covers the United States, Canada, and Brazil, and is consistently ranked among the top analysts in aerospace. So we're hoping Ron can catch up with us fairly soon. These resumes are highly abridged. Each one of these folks has a resume as long as your arm. So hopefully nobody feels like we've given you short shrift, but sometimes these can take a long time to read. So I'm going to go ahead and defer to and kick this off with Richard. I know you got a couple of slides you want to share. Go ahead and take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Glenn. It's great to be here with everybody in this sadly virtual world of Zoom that we're all struggling to come to terms with until things open up. My job here is to kind of frame the discussion before we all contribute our thoughts into what Boeing's requirements are and how to move forward. I believe we're going to have a few slides I'd sent along shared. Do I have that right? There we go. Excellent. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to make the point that just because Boeing shelved NMA doesn't mean that was the wrong move. We're going to argue today, I think the three of us are in violent agreement that Boeing needs to do something in the middle market segment. Was NMA necessarily the right thing? No, far from it. It was always a tall order to square that circle, to use geometric shapes. Basically to use a twin aisle jet to compete with a single aisle jet. As you'll see in a moment, the A321neo family is doing fantastic work for Airbus. NMA, a twin aisle design, would have had a very hard time fighting back against it. And here you can see a chart or two charts. One shows realized price per seat as a kind of proxy for manufacturing costs for single aisles in blue and twin aisles in red. The one to the right, chart to the right, shows operating economics. And as you can see, there's a pretty big gap. So I know Boeing had a number of compelling stories to tell, and some very good ones, about NMA being able to bridge that gap. But if they couldn't quite do it, then they were quite right to put it down and walk away and hopefully consider an alternative design that will allow them to fend off the 321neo. Next page, please. Now, let's look at backlogs, which of course are changing sadly because of this terrible pandemic that's taking such a hit, that's giving the industry such a hit. It's not a happy story though for Boeing. If you look at that blue bar, they're the ones who are really trending downward with over 1,000 cancellations this year. If you remove the ASC 606 provisions, which basically remove some of the backlog that is associated with airlines that are financially distressed, you don't get that much of an improvement. You see that green bar to the right, those are the November 2020 numbers. And even the gap between the green, which is Boeing adjusted to include the ASC 606, and the Airbus line, it's still pretty substantial. Now, some of that is MAX cancellations because of the MAX's lateness. Airlines are, because of the MAC clause, able to get out of their commitments with no penalty of any sort. But as you'll see in a moment, a bigger part of it is that 321neo. Next page, please. And this chart shows the backlogs by segment. And as you can see, I don't know whether it's been cut off in the bottom of people's screen, but thank you, perfect. The real disparity between Airbus and Boeing is in that 200-seat single aisle segment. There's a bit of a mismatch between the less than 150-seat segment, where the 737 MAX 7 is holding off the A220 and 319neo, but it's not that big a segment. That's not a growth segment. That was where Boeing was going to counterattack by acquiring Embraer's jetliner unit, and that would have restored parity, but well, that's water under the bridge. 150-seat single aisles, 737 MAX 8 versus A320neo, just holding its own just fine. As a matter of fact, when they firm up the Ryanair orders, you'll even see the Boeing line go a little bit ahead. And then you've got the wide bodies to the right, where both you average them together and you get parity. But look at that 200-seat single aisle segment. That is enormous. It is the biggest single segment of the jetliner business. And very simply, the 737 MAX 9 and 10 don't seem to be commercially competitive with the 321neo, especially in the LR and XLR configurations, where the advantage Airbus has with its greater range really seems to be weighing on things. So it's my thesis, and I think a lot of people who are my peers in this business, including my good friends on the call with me, regard this as a bit of a game changer for Airbus and for the industry. This is, in fact, the pivot. And next page, please. And what we've done here is we've gone ahead and projected out what we think are likely numbers. And Boeing's at the bottom there. At the top, you've got Russian and Chinese numbers, just a thin trickle. Red is Airbus, except for the 321neo. And then that light pink, that is the 321neo. Effectively, that becomes the hinge here that gets Airbus to 60% market share by the end of our 10-year forecast. Now, what's kind of scary about this chart is that it reflects some extremely conservative thinking on our part. For example, right now the backlog for the 321neo is just a little over 3,000 jets. The only thing we have in the 321neo segment is about 3,500 jets. In other words, we think that, and well, I can't tell you whether this is true or not, but we're making the conservative assumption that they don't continue to rack up big A321neo orders at the expense, say, of 787s and A330neos and other mid-market twin-aisle jetliners. It's quite possible that they do. It's quite possible that the 60-40 story becomes a 65-35 story by the end of the decade, or even 70-30. And if history tells us one thing in the jetliner business, it's that it's really tough to recover from that kind of drop in market share, from going from 50-50 to 60-40 or even 65-35. It's easy to get demoralized and not do anything, as McDonnell Douglas did back in the 80s and 90s, until, of course, it exited the jetliner business.
And we do want to come back to that. I want to say Ron Epstein has been able to join us now, but I want to bounce over to Kevin for a minute. You were hearing what Richard was saying about this gap, about the middle market that Boeing was intending to put in for this middle market airplane, kind of above high-end 737 size, smaller than the 787 on the smaller end of that larger, of course, twin aisle airplane. You work a lot in the MRO sector, but this really is not a repair question. But when you look at that secondary market for these kinds of airplanes, how do you plug that in? Because the hope here is that this middle market airplane, whatever we end up calling it, is going to be built here in the greater Seattle metro area.
So your question is what is the impact of the secondary market on demand here for
In a way, in the sense that, I mean, I want to get your opening statement here, but sort of couple those two together, because one of the things that airlines look at is not only fuel burn, et cetera, but is looking at that secondary market saying, when I'm done with this airplane, who's going to buy it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the middle of the market gap is real, and I think we're all in agreement something has to be done. And I think we have a little bit different opinions between the three of us, in terms of when and what it could be. But Richard points out, what he points out here is very real as far as the economics. And I think there are other factors that must be taken into account with what Boeing was looking at doing earlier with the NMA. It was going to be a twin aisle by all accounts, and some of the analysis that I heard about suggested you could get more flights out of it daily because you could embark and disembark passengers faster. So if you could fly an extra flight a day or an extra bank a day, that could make a difference. I think now they're not going to build the NMA. They're going to build possibly something different. We'll explore that here today. And I guess where I would come in on that is I think it has to be something that's maybe a little bit smaller in a world where airlines are down gauging. And that could, in fact, take us into a world of a single aisle to overcome some of the economic issues that Richard discussed. Could we be looking at some sort of a 757 type aircraft loaded with new technologies? The 757, people always ask, why don't they start that back up? It's too expensive. And it's 1970s technology and a 1970s wing. It's not going to work. But it isn't to say that if you loaded it with today's technology and new propulsion technology, that you couldn't create a compelling value.
So now that we have Ron with us, I often hear you on the Boeing quarterly calls. You're up there with the analyst section. What are you kind of bringing here today that you really want to get across?
A couple things. One, I'm strongly of the view that they need to do a product to counter their competitor. Two, and I think this might be a little bit counter to maybe common thought, that I interact with the investment community a lot, and just informally surveying the investment community. About 2/3 of the investors I speak to think that Boeing has to do an airplane to remain competitive with Airbus. So one, the investment community actually sees this as something that the company has to do. And similar to that, about 2/3 of the investment community wouldn't see the investment in a new airplane as a negative. So I think the narrative is, and the logic tends to be, if Boeing were to launch a new airplane, that would require investment. Investors always get kind of queasy around investment, but not when that investment is required to keep the company competitive and lock in its future. So, I mean, and I think that's probably one of the messages that I would want to bring forward from the investment community, is that about 2/3 of the investment community, at least the people I talk to, would see it as necessary and potentially a positive. Of course, that's predicated on execution and so on and so forth, but this wouldn't immediately be thought of by the investment community as a negative. And in fact, when you think about the time that it would take to bring something to market and the recovery in the cycle, that you could be bringing something to market when the market's hot again, right? I mean, ultimately, this too shall pass. And if you were to get a windfall of orders with a new plane in a market recovery, the market.
So I want to come back to the question of building it where. I want to tell our audience now, because we're getting close to that time, we will be taking your questions if you're here on the Zoom call. There is a button down at the bottom to ask a question. We can see what those questions are, and hopefully we can get to them all. We'll see. We're going to about 2:30 Pacific time. Let's talk about the situation we're in now. Obviously, we have the COVID pandemic that is still just destroying international flying, which remains down about 85%. Domestic flying in the United States which is what I focus on, is still down 60-ish%. There was kind of a boost for much of the country, although the health folks certainly argued against it about flying, although that didn't necessarily happen here so much at SeaTac in Seattle. But the question is, and Ron just alluded to it, is the world beyond Boeing. All three of you are talking as if we're already there. But how much more do we have to get through? They're cutting 30,000 jobs. A lot of those are going to be, if not most of those, out of commercial airplanes. How do we get through the next 6 months or so before everybody in the world is inoculated, has the vaccine, even if that doesn't take longer than that? How do we just get through the next 6 to 9 months? Who wants to take that?
Maybe I'll start with that. Yeah, maybe I'll start here. I think when we say we, I think it all, we need to start with the customer. If you can't have healthy manufacturers without healthy airlines. And the world's airlines, roughly an $800 billion industry, world's airlines are going to lose over $80 billion in the last 6 months of this year, at least. And the estimates keep going up. And this winter is going to be absolutely brutal. Of course, winter is usually where this is the lull, where airlines incur losses that they make up for in the summer when it's busy. Well, guess what? The lull in this year's winter coincides with the ongoing pandemic and the shutdown of travel. And it's going to be a brutal winter for the customers. And we've already had upwards of 1,500 aircraft retirements announced this year, and that is probably going to continue through the winter. And so I think we need to look hard at airlines. And without healthy airlines, there can't be a healthy Boeing.
Now, David Calhoun, Boeing CEO, has made the argument that, a lot of airlines are not going to put those older planes that are now parked back up in the air. They're going to come to Boeing, and by inference to Airbus, they're going to go to the manufacturers and get newer ones. Do you believe that?
I wouldn't be so sanguine on that. And I know Richard and Ron have opinions on this, but the bottom line is that right now fuel is relatively cheap. And if say a 15-year-old aircraft, a 17-year-old aircraft, as long as it's not coming up on an expensive maintenance event, it's less expensive to put, even with higher fuel burn, it's less expensive to put one of these back into service than to take new delivery. So that is one of the headwinds that OEMs face, like Boeing. As we recover, you're going to be competing with, there are 8,000 aircraft right now that are parked, and airlines have to make decisions on whether or not to bring them into service. And if you take deliveries, of course, in a weak demand environment, you have a choice. You can go pick up a used market or used aircraft for very little money.
So Ron and Richard, where do you kind of fall in on getting through this next 6 to 9 months, and where are we at when the pandemic is in the history books?
Well, it's not going to be pretty, of course. As Kevin says, it comes down to getting the airlines healthy, and they're a long way from healthy given the decline in air traffic that you talk about. Historically, it's been sort of almost historically inevitable. You get 7 good years, 3 bad years, 7 good years, 3 bad years. It's always been that way, but it's been 14 or 15 years since we've had a downturn. So we're kind of in uncharted territory, especially since the numbers are so unprecedented in terms of the decline in traffic. We don't know how long this will take, and most likely it'll be a comeback in single aisle traffic or single aisle traffic and jetliner production before there's a comeback in international traffic and twin aisle production. And even then, you'll see a secular shift away from twin aisles and toward single aisles for international routes. So that's a factor too. One thing that I can virtually guarantee, though, is that people want to fly. Numbers are going to come back. This industry does have a tendency to turn on a dime. And by the time a new project got going in terms of industrial launch and, orders being solicited and whatever else, you'd probably start to see green shoots. In other words, it might be an incredibly ugly 2 or 3 years, but in the time frame we're talking about for a new product that secures Boeing's future, by the time things get going, this product will be in a really good place.
Which is what we've seen historically before.
Yeah. I mean, remember the 757 and 767 were launched right in the middle of the rather god-awful late 70s, early 80s environment 777 launched in the middle of the early 90s downturn.
Yeah.
You don't think about when a plane is launched, you think about when it's going to arrive. And if we're talking about a launch, a firm industrial launch, 2022, say, and an arrival in EIS in 27 or 28, those dovetail very nicely with market dynamics that are likely to be around. And even if not, you launch a program for a 30-year life cycle at a bare minimum. So you just can't really time it. The most you can do is suffer through the bad times and plan for the long term.
So Ron, and coupling with that, when you look out there, Boeing stock back up into the 240 range. Today, I'm looking at the close 236, 236.51. Put that in investment terms, because right now the stock market seems to like what Boeing's doing. The MAX is flying again. The first, I think, commercial flight down in Brazil is tomorrow. American has been doing some demonstration flights. Is that sort of paving over? And I want to go back to the middle market in a minute, but is that sort of paving over reality here, just based on exuberance over the MAX among certain people to get back in the air?
So we haven't seen the performance just with Boeing, right? So there's been what's been called the reopening trade. So we've seen airlines trade higher. We've seen Boeing trade higher. We've seen Airbus trade higher. We've seen the suppliers trade higher. Any entity that's tied to the reopening of the economy, reopening of travel, the companies that were impacted the worst, we've seen a rebound there. So ultimately, where the share price today, and the debate I would say among investors is, how quickly will the 737 deliveries recover? How much cash will those 737 deliveries generate? It's no secret that this year, many of those deliveries aren't going to generate much cash because they're being paid for with PDPs that were already paid. Boeing's been pretty, I think, straightforward with the market, saying, hey, you know what, in 2021, we're still probably going to burn cash. Now, bear in mind, they're going to burn cash when they're reversing an inventory of 737s and also reversing an inventory of 787s. That says to me that the 737s aren't going to generate much cash. So the big question and debate, I think, among investors with Boeing right now is, how much cash will they generate by when? And that's a big function of really two programs. The 787 program, which they just cut to 5, is that as low as it goes? Maybe, maybe not, probably, who knows, we'll see. But last time the stock was at its highs, remember 787 production was at 14 per month, and 737 production was supposed to go to the mid 50s. It never quite made it there. And then 78 stayed there for a little while, and now they've cut it back pretty substantially. And then the one point I would add to the comments that both Richard and Kevin made before about the outlook post-pandemic, and I think this is a point of debate on the street. What happens to business travel? How quickly does it recover? And over what time frame? And surprisingly, my sense is that business travel will come back pretty robustly. But I'm finding myself more in a minority, actually, in that case, that it seems like there's this consensus growing that there'll be some sort of secular shift to business travel. We'll see how that plays out. That's not the camp I fall in, but it does seem like there's an increasing group of folks in the investment community that do believe that kind of less will be more in terms of business travel, because of all the supplements that we're getting with things like Zoom and WebEx and so on and so forth.
I want to get to a couple of questions here, and this kind of refers to something that we talked about off camera yesterday. It's from Rich. He says, Boeing and the investment community may want to launch an aircraft, but what about the engine companies? There does not appear to be any near-term engine technology developed to significantly improve fuel burn. Realistically, hybrid or hydrogen will not be matured until late in this decade or even into the next decade. You had referred to that before, and that seems to be a real missing gap in terms of developing something that's an all-new jet.
Well, ultimately, you build an airframe around an engine, a power plant. And if you don't have a power plant or a new power plant, do you want to make all the investment in a new aircraft? Now, can you do derivative products that could make sense? So for example, can you do a bigger version of a GTF a GTF with a different gear ratio, with a different gear layout? Sure, you can. So are there, derivative strategies you can do with a power plant that gives you more than you have today, but isn't quite hydrogen?
Let me take another question here from Stan. He says, Ronald said, quote, investors can be queasy about investments. That seems to be at the heart of Boeing's failure to put competitive products into the marketplace. Shareholders have benefited from $70 billion in share repurchases since the merger. Have you seen signs, I'm taking it he's referring to McDonnell Douglas, have you seen signs that executives and investors are ready to take on more risk for long-term gain? Well, haven't they done that in terms of 777X, the use of composites in 787 MAX? Not so much. I mean, that was hanging in a new engine on an older airframe. How does it strike you?
Well, I think the sense on 787 was maybe a bridge too far. They took too much risk with that aircraft, and then they backed way off. And ultimately, if it's to remind everybody, 737 MAX was quote unquote supposed to be a simple derivative. Not that anything you do in an airplane is simple, but it was supposed to be a simple derivative. And in the end, it's going to cost as much, I would estimate, maybe more than 787 development cost them. So when you think about airplane development and you think about different strategies you can take, sometimes the path that you think is more cost effective, it may not be. And in the case of 737 MAX, that's clearly going to be the case. 737 MAX probably will cost the company on the order of $30 billion, and that's about what 787 cost them.
And what was the budget round on that? It was $2 billion. What was Boeing's guidance to the street on the MAX?
On the MAX, $5 billion.
Okay.
So here's a question from the Everett Herald. The 737 MAX has been recertified and the first public flights begin tomorrow, which referred to going forward. How do you think the MAX experience will affect development of the 777X and any new airplane designs? You kind of referred to that just now, that it's, wasn't supposed to be that big of a deal, but obviously because of the grounding and the accident, it's become very expensive. Kevin, you want to take that one?
I'll start with that. I mean,
Yeah.
I can think clearly. I think the way that certification has evolved, where more of the authority has evolved to the OEMs, to Boeing, and this was made light of in the press quite a bit. I mean, a lot of that was absolutely necessary because there just are not enough experts at the FAA. But I think what's pretty clear is that regulatory capture occurred, and therefore in the 777X, I think the betting here is it's just the FAA is going to be extra careful on this. And I don't know that there's going to be wholesale changes in the certification process, but it's yet another part of a headwind that Boeing faces on the 777X, along with a lot of the demand coming from the Middle East, where where we've had a lot of financial carnage recently, and also the fact that suddenly the 777X is the biggest aircraft in production. Is this an XA380 or not? This is something Richard's written about for many, many years on that, but those are also issues with.
So Richard, take that point. Your name just came up.
Well, a couple issues, one, just to follow on to Kevin's comments about certification, I think the big thing that's going to be a factor in perhaps delaying stuff is the issue of international global, aircraft certification reciprocity, and what EASA, CAA, and or CAAC in China, and all the other regulatory agencies require by way of oversight and, redoing what the FAA will be doing, because it's going to take a while before we get that full certification reciprocity back. So I think that's one big area of concern. In terms of a big aircraft, there are multiple problems here. As Kevin says, this is a market that's trending away from big jets, and this is the biggest jet there is. Not only that, but they shouldn't have gone to rate 8.5 for the 777-300ER as long as they did, or perhaps not at all, because there's now this tremendous overhang of 777-300ERs, and frankly, not that big a user community of international customers. So it's going to take a while before you get above, say, rate 3 or 4. And of course, there are even dire fears of cancellation, which I don't believe for a minute. I just think it'll take a long time for that overcapacity situation to be mopped up. for certain routes to start to thicken again before people appreciate belly cargo, which the 777 has always done really well. Right now, people are just focused on keeping their nose above water and getting the smallest equipment for the job, no matter what they're doing. Eventually, that mindset's going to change. But in the meantime, it's going to take a while for the 777 to show the kind of numbers that it enjoyed back in the last decade.
With international down as far as it is, I think I used the figure of about 85%. If that's no longer current, let me know. Doesn't Boeing sort of get a break on that? Because that's the market that the 777X is going into. And if Emirates and these other customers, there are not that many of them, say, you know, kind of don't need it right now. That's all right. Take your time. Doesn't that kind of work to Boeing's benefit?
Well, I mean, let's just say they've got time to play with, both in terms of getting this thing certified and for when the market really needs it. But they're going to miss that revenue. I mean, the 777 was a heck of a good producer for them, and it's going to take a while to get back there. And of course, it means a lot of idle capacity. You know, I think, and Kevin's written a lot about this over the years, this shows, you know, the dangers of vertical integration. You know, it's not just the idle capacity associated with the final assembly line, it's the massive wing assembly capabilities they've built up. I don't second guess that. It's just that there's so much capacity that's, well, now vertically integrated at Boeing to produce this jet that's going to be basically spending a couple of years idle. That's going to hurt.
So what do you think of EIS is the buzzword is in the business, but entry into service, the first passenger carrying flights? When's that going to happen? Now, under these circumstances?
Yeah, sure looks like it's a late 22, early 23 story, roughly. It seems the way things are heading, I'm afraid. I mean, you know, again, here we could have the industry come back at, you know, turning on a dime, in which case all of a sudden things could be better again. But right now, this looks like a 2023 story before you see, you know, more than one or two. I mean, what's going to aid eventually some kind of recovery in the twin aisle market is three things. One, no matter how great the 321 Neo is for some international routes, transatlantic, it's really a 4,700 nautical mile story. To do Asia, to do the Middle East, you need a twin aisle. Similarly, well, cargo, that's going to come back. And, you know, belly cargo. And that's going to make a twin aisle like the 777, which has always been fantastic with belly cargo, look good too. And then on top of that, you're just going to have, you know, natural route thickening. You're going to see the fragmentation of new routes. I don't know, Madrid to Washington, I hope. But eventually those will start to thicken again as the fragmentation process runs its course. It's just going to take a lot of this decade to play out.
So here's a question I want to bounce over to Kevin and Ron, which is, we have seen Boeing has argued that, look, the pandemic has forced them to move all of their 787 Dreamliner production to Charleston, South Carolina, which has long been sort of the center of gravity for that program. They're saying it's because of the pandemic. It's because cash flow is not there. That has caused a lot of anxiety in this market, not only among people at Boeing, but people who supply Boeing. And I want to come back to suppliers in a minute, although they're sort of not directly affected here. What do you say about if the 787 comes back in demand again, whether that's a year from now, 2 years from now, is some of that production going to come back here? Is there still tooling here in the plant to put that back to work?
You want me to jump in? Yeah, I'll jump in
Sure.
real quick. Yeah, my guess would be no, right? I mean, moving aircraft production lines across the country multiple times in a short frequency of years, and just to call it just a couple of years, is a horribly inefficient way to build aircraft. So, you know, sadly, it seems like 787 is going to be in South Carolina. That's where it's going to be. Now, the reality is, having two production lines at 5 per month, that's completely untenable, right? I mean, that wasn't a solution. So they had to make a decision. They have a big campus, obviously everybody knows, down in South Carolina. And if demand comes back to a level where they have to get to more than 7 per month, right? Because each campus was going to do 7 per month, they could probably get more capacity out of South Carolina. I imagine that's what they do. So really, that ultimately begs the question: what do you do with your capacity in the Pacific Northwest, namely the Everett facility. So I wouldn't bank on 787 coming back, just because of the economics of that is untenable after it's moved and it's there.
So 87 will be gone in the next 6 months ish. 47 will shut down in 22. Although Richard just talked about maybe cargo comes back. That filled that niche for a long time, but it has not been. They have not been flying out the door. No pun intended. Kevin, when you look at that, particularly going again to, and I want to segue this a little bit into the suppliers, when you see what's happening on that front, and I got a question here from Michael Bruno from AvWeek. He said, gentlemen, should suppliers consider shifting more toward Airbus as market share shifts? You work with the suppliers a lot.
Yeah, and this is for suppliers. You know, there's not only the dynamics of demand that Richard talked about in his opening slides, you know, and we've gone from this cozy 50-50 duopoly to something that looks more like 60-40 or possibly even a little bit more, certainly in the near to medium term. But the overlay on this is what the suppliers have gone through. And if you think about, you know, suppliers, if you go back in time, Boeing launched Partnering for Success back in the early part of this decade. And I think the suppliers are well aware of what that is: unilateral price concessions, revised payment terms, other demands. And that actually started to weaken suppliers by pulling working capital. You know, if you're a small supplier and you're getting paid on 90-day payment terms or 120-day payment terms, in effect, you're being the bank to a much larger company with a lower cost of capital. Then the suppliers were asked to get ready for this big ramp up, you know, to possibly 60 single aisles a month, as well as the big twin aisle production rates. And they had to show rate readiness. So they had to invest capital into their plants to expand capacity. Then early this year, the MAX shuts down production. And now we have the COVID crisis and we have this big gap, you know, in what's happening. So it's a tough deal. And if you're a supplier now, you know, it's, Boeing has burned bridges with many of its leading suppliers, even before this crisis, through the Partnering for Success initiative and others. You know, the famous McNerney no-fly list, where if you don't play ball by our rules, then forget about you. You're not going to be on the next aircraft. And I think what this crisis reminds us is Boeing needs its suppliers. You know, suppliers help reduce risk. Suppliers prevent you from building up too much capacity that sits idle in crises like this, to Richard's point earlier. And now here we are. So I do think there is a real risk. And I'll tell you, the feedback I get from suppliers is that Boeing's a little bit more humble these days compared to what it was. But there's much clearer communication and direction coming out of Airbus than there is out of Boeing right now. And there's a big job that Boeing has to not only rebuild relations, but I think just building community and credibility with the suppliers. If it's your capital at work and Boeing is telling you they're getting to 31 single aisles a month by the end of next year, do you commit your capital to it? Do you believe Boeing? So the credibility of the OEM is absolutely critical in what suppliers do, especially the small and medium enterprises that are on the brink of survival, many of them, in trying to figure out where do they allocate their precious capital.
So I'm looking at this picture out of one of, Richard will see this is familiar. This is sort of the state ranking. Dark blue was good, and this is the aviation aerospace competitiveness economic study. But a big part of this that said Washington was number one was the number of suppliers that are here, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I mean, to a certain extent, competitiveness is a function of success, right? You know, you have a big pool of, well, a big community of skilled workers. You have all of the educational facilities that help create more skilled workers. You've got the infrastructure associated with aircraft production. You've got all of these things. And there aren't that many superclusters in the world, referred to Kevin's great book, Aerodynamic, that talks about 4 clusters in a funeral, I believe, which shows the death of one such cluster in Southern California. It's tough to create them, but they can be destroyed. And I think we've got to be very careful here in moving forward with the superclusters that we've got.
So we have a supercluster with the world's biggest building that is getting emptier, and will be quite empty here in the next couple of years. This does go back in a way to the middle market airplane, whatever that is. And one of the questions went to, does anybody know anything specific about what that really needs to be without a new engine? Derivatives, I mean, the MAX 10, you're saying, is not going to cut it into that competition with the A321neo, but the A321neo is itself a derivative. So when you look out there and you go, I mean, what is going to go into that giant Everett facility, if anything?
Ideally, this plane. I think it makes an enormous amount of sense. You even save on, some of your investment costs associated. Not that buildings cost that much, but it helps out a little bit. And obviously, having the trained cadre of workers and whatever else is certainly useful. I think the exam answer is really clear for Boeing, and the necessity is really clear for Boeing, and the mode of doing it is pretty clear for Boeing. It's just, do they have the leadership and wherewithal to do it?
And it's not just manufacturing capacity, although that's justifiably the focus of this, this discussion. But it's not just that. It's maintaining your engineering core. And a question that we ask ourselves a lot is, after the 777X is complete, what are Boeing's engineers going to work on? What are your aerodynamicists going to work on? I mean, you need to keep a steady flow of either major white sheet programs or iterations or something, to keep it going. And this is an enormous challenge. And what's interesting about this time that we're in right now is that there are enormous possibilities with digital tools, really harnessing some things that Boeing is learning actually on the military side of its business, and bringing it up over into the commercial side, where you have a real possibility of reducing development time and cost, and really easing that transition between design and production with the digital tools. And Boeing has talked a lot about this, but we're at a point now where there's an opportunity. We just need a big commercial program to realize it. So it's not just manufacturing, it's harnessing the digital possibilities and taking us into the next era right now.
So Ron, you had said to me in the past that you can sort of argue both sides of the issue here. This conversation all around has been kind of depressing. Where's the positive? Is there a positive?
Well, yes, there can be. So I think you have to ask the question, and we've sort of bounced around this: how did we get here? Right? I mean, ultimately, the pandemic has proven to be, call it the great amplifier. If you had weaknesses going into the pandemic, they got amplified. If you had strengths going into the pandemic, they got amplified. So coming out of this, it really does look like Airbus is in a stronger position in the narrow body market than Boeing. Well, I think you have to ask yourself, why? How did they get there? What decisions were made? From an investor perspective, investors focused on return of cash to investors through share buybacks and a dividend. But then you have to ask yourself, looking backwards now, after all the cash that got burned on 737, where we are today, how much cash in the end really did get generated? Was the decisions that were made, did it take the company to the right place? So I think, a silver lining to this, a silver lining to any big disruption can cause change. Is the company going to make the changes that are required for its path forward? Everything from corporate governance, how it thinks about investment, how it thinks about its culture, how it thinks about product development. So I think, the positive that can come out of this is a moment where you can, as a company, sit back and think, okay, how can we do this better going forward? And how do we prevent this from ever happening again? And you can't blame the pandemic clearly on them, but the position they were in and the weak position they were in going into the pandemic, you can blame on how the company was run and the culture of the company.
Glenn, could I kick
Yeah,
in?
please.
another hopeful comment. I think very hopeful. There's as much opportunity here as there is thread. I don't mean to paint the A321neo as 10 feet tall, far from it. It's a 30-something-year-old design. It's a derivative of a variant, and it's frankly not optimal for what it's being asked to do. It is very much in the right place at the right time, in a time of twin aisle down gauging and a secular shift away towards single aisles. It's simply the biggest and most capable single aisle you can get with the biggest engine you can put under a single aisle's wings. But if Boeing does something right, using all the tools that Kevin outlined and everything at its disposal in the latest technology, even if it's a current generation engine, scaled up geared turbofan or what have you, you're still talking about a killer product that could easily get 2/3 of the share of a hot growing market. That's a huge opportunity here.
Which leads us back to the middle market again. So Boeing could never seem, in all the conversations that in press events that I'd been to with them, they're saying, we're working on it, we're talking to our customers, we're trying to figure this out. There's been a number of comments here, single aisle, twin aisle, a lot of comments about engines needing really a new engine generation, a new technology to put under. So to me, it's sounding like maybe you can figure out the single aisle, twin aisle stuff, people getting off quickly. I know we ran some patent drawing years ago of this little stout airplane with twin aisles in it that you could load, unload, and load very quickly. That kind of didn't seem to come out of this. But it sounds like they can't move forward and they can't really move backward either. Somebody want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, let me jump in on that one. To Boeing's credit, they already built the airplane that they need. It was just a couple generations old. I mean, they just need a modern 757. When you look at the A321XLR, the airplane, like Richard, I think aptly said, isn't 10 feet tall. It's just replacing 757s on that mission. Boeing already did that. They understand the dynamics, I think, of that market, and they had an airplane that did it. So, what's the point I'm trying to make?
They also abandoned it
in
in 2005. That's a long time ago.
And I think if you ask some Boeing folks in a quiet moment, they'll say they never should have. It's an expensive airplane to build. I've heard that. Requires a lot of parts, has a lot of fasteners. But they probably did abandon it too early. And it's just kind of go full circle back to the beginning of the conversation. We've talked about early on about a lot of airplanes that are going to get retired. Rewind the clock to, call it 2000, 2002, 2003. The 757 was dead. They're going to shut it down. That class of airplane right now is the most desired class of airplane potentially in the market, right? So it's the difficulty in this business is you're building products today that are going to be in a market 15, 20 years from now, and you don't know exactly how that market's going to evolve. So you see what I'm saying, Glenn? I mean, they've already been there, right?
But they can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again.
That's true.
I mean, I went out, and I want to go to this question with Kevin because I think this goes directly to it. I remember being at the Delta Airlines Museum in Atlanta, and all the pillars that are holding up this canopy are all those very tall 757 nose gear. The lights on it, the landing lights on it, and everything else. It was kind of cool, but also said that those airplanes are no longer with us. And I had heard about this demand for used 757s, but the newest one is now 15 years old. So, and they're going to be retired because they make no more sense to fly because of their age. And I know United has stretched the legs on them and done some other things, but it kind of goes back to my question. That hole is getting bigger. Delta has ordered a lot of A321neos. Is that battle lost?
It's interesting. With the NMA, when it was being looked at, there were really two markets for the NMA. And the first market was U.S., North America and Europe, 7576 replacement, long haul domestic, transcontinental and transatlantic. And that was one source of demand. And that demand was fundamentally around the mid-2020s when all of these 757s and 76s were set to retire, maybe some of the A330s. The second market was domestic Asia and domestic China, and that's out more around 2030, you know. And so where are we today and what's going on? Well, with the situation outlined, I mean, I could make an argument that you could build a single aisle, something that has a footprint much like the 757 with new technology, and get really good economics out of it. You know, the 757 was an overpowered aircraft. You know, it's the only aircraft you really know which one you're in. You can feel it. You can close your eyes because it's so overpowered. You put two 40,000-pound engines on an aircraft that didn't need it. And so I think there's a lot of room with the new tools out there, advanced materials, and with, you know, a scaled up geared turbofan, or maybe a Leap X with a gear on it. I don't know if there's time to do it, but GE and CFM have been working on gears. I think there's time to put something out there, even something that's single aisle that addresses some of the issues Richard's outlined here. Or possibly it could be a smaller version of the NMA that Boeing was looking at before, which was somewhere between 220 and 270 seats. Fundamentally, you got to deal with the MAX 9, MAX 10, and create some open playing field for yourself. And look, we're fragmenting routes, and the 321, as Richard pointed out, is range limited. What's going to do the job?
I want to take a question here. Nobody put their name to this one, but says, what are the areas for growth, for innovation, for methanol, hydrogen, or electric fueled vehicles in the Pacific Northwest and the associated workforce needs? How can we turn the need for decarbonization to address climate change into an opportunity for the Pacific Northwest? That's something that's a big factor in all of this that we really haven't talked about yet, which is the effects of climate change and the pressure that has been building on this industry really since about 2005, 2006.
Maybe I'll start out with this, and Ron and Richard, you can tell me where I'm wrong or add to it. But it's a great question, and the industry set a goal for itself by 2050, you know, to get to a point where emissions would be, 20 or 50% of what they were in 2020. It's an ambitious goal, and not a lot of attention has been paid to it, quite frankly, except in Europe. In Europe, they take it extremely seriously, and in certain parts of the United States, like the Pacific Northwest. But right now, you know, it's interesting. If we were having this conversation a year ago, we would be talking about hybrid electric and could that work? And I think what the industry has kind of figured out over the last year or 2 years is that hybrid electric and electric propulsion, it's not ready for prime time in large aircraft. It's just the economics and the physics don't get you there. Although it could certainly have a role in smaller aircraft, even in regional aircraft and in commuter aircraft. And we're seeing, you know, some demos with companies like MagnetX in the Pacific Northwest right now. Now hydrogen's come on, and that is the new big thing. But this industry always takes longer. We're talking about changing the infrastructure. We're talking about changing the technology of aircraft. We're talking about changing the regulation. And I just think, unfortunately, it's going to take much longer to get to hydrogen than people would like, much longer. And some people are talking early 2030s, add 10 years onto that. And that to me says that you're probably back to biofuels and buying carbon offsets, at least for the big long range aircraft. Hydrogen will not get you, that isn't to say you don't work on it now, but it is to say that that isn't something that's going to change Boeing's fortunes here in the next 5 to 7 years. It's just one more thing it has to work on.
I would just add to Kevin's point. I think if you look at the global carbon emissions, aviation accounts for maybe 3.5%, 4% of it in total. I think that's the right number, maybe 2%. It's not a big contributor to it. And if you compare that to what autos contribute in terms of carbon, autos are something like 20 to 25%. Big difference between the two.
And
so the industry writ large actually isn't that big of a carbonizer, or whatever, however you want to call it. So I'm with Kevin 100%. I mean, a lot of this technology is just not ready for prime time and won't be.
One of the things that I remember going to the IATA conference in 2006, and you guys are talking about numbers, and the argument was made then, look, aviation worldwide is only 2% of the carbon footprint. And in the United States, again, 15 years ago, there was not a lot of publicity pressure on the climate front against the airlines. That's changed somewhat, but the airlines are also going, there's a lot going on with biofuel, which then was just really in its infancy. But when you go to, if you went to Europe, I mean, when you were listening to executives from KLM, Air France, British Airways, there were protests in that time frame there. So Europeans on the street weren't having any of that argument, even though I can certainly, I'm hearing the numbers argument, and that's pressure.
I don't know. It just seems that the problem is localized to Northern Europe, and I don't call it a problem. I mean, young people do have ideas about the environment that I completely respect, but it isn't showing up in the data yet. I mean, it's not like people were not flying up into this crisis. It's not like you had this massive fall off in travel demand in Europe associated with that. Yes, you did have the famous KLM website where it said, do you have to travel? Do you have to buy this ticket? And people said, yep. They just went ahead and did it. So I understand the need to experiment for the future and to pay attention to these things. But given the technological maturation issues that Ron and Kevin speak about, and given the fact that so far people are quite content to keep flying despite concerns, I don't think it's anything imminent that we have to deal with. I am intrigued by the Pacific Northwest angle. It does seem that that combination of entrepreneurialism and engineering and background aviation, there's going to be a lot of money spent on alternative propulsion concepts, as Kevin said.
And that's already happening in small aircraft here.
It's already happening with Magnex and other programs. It did happen in Zunum. I guess that's in the rear view mirror now. And of course, hydrogen, now the new thing. There'll be opportunities for the Pacific Northwest to lead the way in that because of those capabilities and that entrepreneurial environment. I'd like to see more startups that take advantage of it, but how sticky will the funding be? We just don't know. Right now, the Europeans are throwing in €1 billion for a zero emission aircraft. What will the next fiscal year bring? And what kind of IRAD will we see at companies to match that? I suspect very little. So in other words, we'll just have to wait and see before we know how much cash is actually going to go into these sort of experiments.
I know one of the areas you guys wanted to talk about, and we're about an hour into this so far with about a half an hour to go, is the historical context, because aviation's now been around for, the Boeing Company alone has been around for 104 years now. Hard to believe. Kevin, you're from Detroit, so you've got a certain perspective on this because of the auto industry there. And Dominic Gates of the Seattle Times put in a question. He says, we're talking about this middle market mystery airplane, whatever that's going to be. He says, so why the assumption that that next plane will be here?
Yeah.
Will it be here?
Yeah. Yeah, I am from Detroit and I am here now. And I'll tell you, it is, and we're in a super cluster, right? There are a lot of tier 1 automotive companies around here. They're not doing as much manufacturing these days, but most of the automotive engineering in the US is done in this area. But a lot of the manufacturing, just like we saw Charleston and for Airbus Mobile, we saw those moves in the automotive industry about 30 years ago, to shops in the South. And it wasn't just the US, it was European OEMs coming to the US and setting up shop, in Alabama. I mean, one of the reasons that Airbus chose Alabama in part is because automotive factories were set up there a decade before, and you develop a skilled workforce and training programs to create that. So really the automotive industry paved the way for what happened in these new facilities in aerospace. And I think for the Puget Sound area, it's in this area, I would say labor management relations now are much better than they were. I mean, both sides are working together. And I think Michigan no longer does not take automotive for granted. It fights for the jobs, it fights for the factories. And they found, a better place, a better medium ground to collaborate. But I think that is the warning. And of course, the state of Washington and the workers have done everything they can, as far as I can tell. But I also think, to Richard's point, study Southern California. I mean, Southern California was the biggest aerospace cluster in history. There were 15 aircraft OEMs out of the top 25 in Southern California at one time. And it all went away very fast in the late 80s and 1990s. They lost 2/3 of their workforce. Some of that was the end of the Cold War, but some of it was just companies moving away. Some of that was McDonnell Douglas getting bought by Boeing, you know, and Lockheed going away. And they're really important stories to study.
Yeah.
If I may, you know, one comment, the center of mid-sized jetliner production now is in Hamburg, which has been building jets for a very long time and building aircraft for a very long time. In other words, it doesn't have to be some kind of new startup or new zone of production at Charleston to make sense.
And it makes parts that it sends to Mobile, Alabama.
Well, that's true, but Mobile, Alabama is 4 per month, whereas you know, we're looking more at 20 or probably when they ramp up 30 or 40 per month in Hamburg. It's really just a different scale. Ditto for Tianjin and you know, whatever else they stand up. But I guess all the drivers of competitiveness tend to stay with us in terms of workforce, in terms of infrastructure. You know, per Dominic's question, it's not like there's this giant sucking sound towards completely new aircraft production facilities. There are some places where more labor-intensive forms of production might make sense to migrate. Querétaro has done very well. North Africa, again, per Kevin's book, has done very well for some things. But in terms of building aircraft, it's the traditional high-skill, high-wage areas that have been extremely successful.
So you think that will keep paying, because that was one of your points in your report, along with your co-author from a couple of years ago.
Yes, that's right.
There's two questions here that I want to couple together. One's from Michael. He says, with 7 colleges and apprenticeship entities training machinists in this region, what is the demand for this workforce over the next 10 years? / from John, in order to secure design and production for the next new airplane program in Washington State, what can Washington State do to have the most impact and be attractive to Boeing? Is there a window of time the state must act in? And that's that window that I got to wonder about. Training, you know, intelligence, quality workforce, both engineering and then the manufacturing and the assembly side here, which is clearly there, versus another part of the country or even another part of the world. Can we keep it going? And on the last 2 programs, to keep 777X here, which goes back to what the machinist had to end up agreeing to in a long-term contract to keep it here, which is part of the labor piece, because we haven't had a strike in quite a while now. And then to land 787 under the Gary Locke administration, which isn't going to be here in another several months. It may not be back, according to you guys.
I think you have to think about that question specifically. What's the when is the opportunity, right? So if this airplane gets launched, when could it get launched? Is it this year? Probably not. Is it next year? Probably not. Maybe the year after that. And then when does that activity heat up? So you're going to go through a period where 777's at very low activity, 78's moving out of town, and there's no new show in town. So to those students in the technical schools, in the machinist schools, I would imagine, I mean, the bad news is it's probably not going to be a very rich environment for work for a couple of years, because you're fighting against recovering from the pandemic on top of the dynamics we've already talked about. I think that's the sad reality. And what can the state of Washington do? I'm not sure in terms of creating work for highly skilled labor, right? I mean, these are highly skilled folks, craftsmen, tradesmen, of the highest regard. What can the state actually do to keep those folks busy? Probably not a lot. And workforces are in some places portable. So do these people move to where the jobs are? Do people do machinists in Seattle find themselves living in the Southeast? Maybe.
You know, there is, though, if I could add to that, though, Ray, I mean, I
Please,
agree
yeah.
with what Ron said, and I think the jobs are also in the suppliers, you know, so the question is, what can the state of Washington do in this? And I would argue, you know, there is one big flaw in this global ecosystem that we have today, and that is that for a long time, it's been all about labor arbitrage, where, you know, we call it the spaghetti chart, where you look at the travel time of a part, where let's say you produce aluminum in, let's say, Spokane, Washington, and it goes on a train to, let's say, Spirit in Wichita, where they mill down the plate to make wing skins. And then it could go someplace else and it eventually comes back. And there is more focus on tightening up the supply chains. In other words, of making them more regional and less global, especially in aerostructures. And I would argue that there's an opportunity for the state of Washington. This may sound paradoxical, but actually to do more aerostructures there. You know, in Eastern Washington, you have a massive aluminum cluster there built around the Kaiser facility and a lot of unique companies, you know, in that area, for example, and the labor costs are a lot lower there as well. I think there's a lot of work to be done in the state of Washington. There are a lot of interior suppliers, and there's an advantage of being located close to the final assembly line if you're in the interiors business. You don't want to be pulling that stuff in from 8,000 miles away. When you're developing new aircraft and doing rapid reconfigurations and customizing for the airlines, there's advantages.
Is that why we've moved from the 787 model, where you're flying in wings from Japan, body sections in from Italy, other pieces out of China, to where at least on the 777X, you've got this massive new $1 billion investment in the wing factory?
You do. I mean, that is one advantage. And that
Part of the
wing,
trend you're talking about.
that is a bit of an anchor. I mean, that is a helpful thing, is to have that wing facility there, because if and when the NMA or the replacement is built, in all likelihood, it's going to have a composite wing. And it's going to, you know, and the logical thing is obviously to use wings from that big investment that Boeing made. And it's very expensive to transport those wings. So it isn't to say that it'll for sure be built there, but it is to say that helps in all of this. But again, my point is also that there are a lot of jobs with the suppliers in the area too, and it's not solely with the final assembly, you know, with Boeing.
If I could also just mention that one big difference between this downturn and the last one is that the defense budget is much bigger today than it was back in 2002 by a significant order of magnitude. The procurement budget is, I believe, 2 or 3 times as large.
Yeah.
And, you know, much that we talk about the death of Southern California as a commercial aerospace cluster, it didn't die in the defense world. As a matter of fact, you can make an argument that a combination of, you know, information technologies, entertainment, and defense served to crowd out commercial, basically made it too expensive as a place to do it. But, you know, I'm not worried about workers in the Pacific Northwest being poached away by to the Southeast. I'm frankly worried about them being poached down to the deserts of California, where they're going to work on the B-21 bomber, which is going to be one of the bigger aerospace growing employer programs of the coming decade or two. So that's something to think about. But getting back, if I may, to the question of what can be done, one of the frustrating aspects of this downturn is that governments have been really eager to put cash into paycheck protection programs for service economy jobs in our industry, airlines. That's essential to avoid mass unemployment, but I'd like to see more talk of this in commercial aero. I hate to talk about government support as being absolutely essential. No one wants to do that, but frankly, again, to avoid the serious economic damage associated with these layoffs, I really think it's incumbent upon Washington, the other Washington here in Washington, D.C., to start thinking about equivalent paycheck protection programs for manufacturing sector workers.
They're struggling to do the $908 billion program here in the next 3 days before they leave Washington again. So one of the questions that came up here from Michael is, gentlemen, should suppliers consider shifting toward Airbus as market share shifts Did we talk about this before already?
We did.
We did. Okay. All right. This is getting long. The I want to sort of bring this around to take the time. We get about 21 minutes left here. If we look at Charleston, you mentioned, Michael, you mentioned the auto business. There's that they're building those Mercedes vans there as well. Boeing's not building those, but that plant is in the neighborhood. You're looking at a lot of flat land all around. You're looking at a developing educational system to help train people up. The state of South Carolina seems to have reeled in quite a bit. You look at Mobile and you look at that Airbus plant, it's not a lot of A320s, but they're now also building the 220 there, which was the C series before, which came out of Canada. A lot of flat land all around there. Here we have a very, very, very large building, and there's land restraint, etc. Do those places just continue to grow and outcompete the Northwest, or does everybody sort of grow going forward? Do we just assume because you can throw up a new assembly building maybe in Charleston that works that much more to their advantage?
Maybe I can start out here and make a point and then let Richard and Ron comment. We've been talking a lot about the NMA or the replacement, and we've been also talking about the Puget Sound. I would argue that, let's suppose, the question came up earlier, if Boeing builds a new aircraft, a new white sheet, why do they necessarily produce in the Pacific Northwest? One argument I would make is that it is much higher risk if you produce in a location that's geographically distant from where it's developed than developing and producing in the same area. In fact, I'm hard pressed to think of an example in the commercial aerospace era where a major new product launch was developed in one place and produced in another. There is a lot of interaction, and I'd argue growing interaction between engineering and production. And that's not meaning you should be sanguine, but I do think with all of the risks that we're talking about with this new aircraft program, we've got market risks, we've got financial risks, we're gonna have to take technology risks to get the operating economics. If you add on top of that, oh, by the way, we're gonna build it in a new location which hasn't built jetliners before, and we're gonna train up the workforce to do it, and trust us, it's gonna be okay. You're adding a whole new layer of risk to what's happening. And as we've learned, something that seems small can quickly grow into 10 and $20 billion. And look, the quality coming out of Charleston has not been sterling, as we found out as well. It's taken a long time to get there. So I do think that is something that Seattle and Puget Sound has going for it as we look at a new aircraft model. It's that interaction, and I like the fact that the wing factory is there as well.
So you're seeing some positives to keep it here.
But one point I would add, though, that we've, I think, overlooked is South Carolina, as an example, like many of the states in the Southeast, are right to work states. Yep. So you don't have to deal with some of the complications that can come with unions. And I'm not making a judgment about unions, but sometimes management teams do. And you don't have to deal with that in the Southeast. So, I think it's a question above my pay grade on how you circle that square. But I am certain, for sure, one of the big attractions to South Carolina is it's a right to work state.
Right. But final assembly, and Richard, you may know this, around final assembly is what, 5% of the cost of an aircraft, something around that? I mean, it's not as if you go to a low cost location and let's say that the labor is 20% cheaper, what does that get you in the end? 100 basis points off your cost, 1% off your cost, 1.5% versus the rest. So yeah, flexible labor is critical. Ron, what Ron's saying, I can testify to. I'm not arguing for right to work states. I will observe that here in Michigan is now a right to work state. I'm not saying that Washington should do that at all, but I am pointing out that in the big picture of the cost structure of an aircraft, final assembly is a very small piece. 70% of the cost of an aircraft is what's sourced from suppliers, which is why this war that Boeing has been going at with their suppliers has been so counterproductive. They're at war with something that accounts for 70% of their cost base.
I think it's also important to remember, well, first of all, as Kevin says, there's, to the best of my knowledge, never been a new program that involved design and production being disaggregated. The Soviets did it that way. You'd have the Nikoyan Design Bureau here with the aircraft built by the Tashkent Aircraft Production Organization there. That went well. It's just generally not regarded as the way to do it. And the other thing is that the transplant lines we've seen, whether it's the Airbus FACOs or Charleston, these are what they call in the military business CKD lines, completely knockdown lines. They're assembling bits and pieces that come up. So the percentage of actual economic value added is super low, maybe even lower than the 5% Kevin cites in these cases. It's just not that, it's not the same as the kind of heavy vertical production you see in Everett or elsewhere. Final point on the subject, to the best of my knowledge, the line has never fully moved. It's really interesting to watch the 787 story, but that's completely different. That's the establishment of a parallel line. Over many years it matures, and then they shifted over. To the best of my knowledge, nobody has ever done anything vaguely like that before. Never said, well, we've developed this aircraft here in, say, Woodford, Britain, and now we're going to move it all the way across country to this other place. I don't think that's ever happened.
Yeah.
So here's
but Jimmy, just going to add this to Richard's point. The difference with 7.8, though, I would argue, is South Carolina was a natural point on how the aircraft parts get aggregated and end up in Seattle. So it's a cluster point where you have parts coming in from Japan, getting aggregated, systems coming together, getting back on the Dreamlifter, going out to Seattle. So I could see the logic behind, well, maybe you just take out that other piece of the spaghetti chart. Like you're chopping out some spaghetti by just keeping it in South. I mean, I can understand that logic. They're not moving it to a greenfield site that was just sort of out of nowhere. It's in the spaghetti chart. So it just.
Well, we haven't seen a big relocation of suppliers out of South Carolina out of this. I mean, and I'll tell you, we're talking about Detroit. I can tell you most of the headquarters of the automotive suppliers are right within 30 miles of the big three or the big two today. They may have production facilities that they've opened, but the vast majority of their suppliers are still in the area. And if you're doing engineering and development or working together, it's hard to do that. So I think I just think that engineering and development angle on this is just a real important advantage that the Pacific Northwest has. And by the way, one other point is we're talking about sustainable and green today. There is a growing focus on the greenhouse gas emissions of producing and moving parts around the world. This spaghetti chart is not only wasteful because it adds cost and time, it's wasteful from the standpoint of adding carbon emissions. And you're starting to see a focus on just what's the greenhouse gas emissions of a supply chain to make an aircraft. And the closer we are together, that can have a positive impact on that. And that concept is starting to get a lot of airplay, certainly in Europe right now.
One of the questions that's come up here, and again, there's a lot of compounding. One of the things I want to get to is incentives, which are gone away. But these are not happy times in aerospace, and a lot of, I mean, God forbid you want to run a restaurant right now. Dominic Gates of the Seattle Times, with the job losses that we're seeing, again, about 30,000 in 2 stages here, and hopefully there's not another one. He says, why won't Boeing make a commitment to turn morale around? Now, I don't know if analysts talk, you're not psychologists here, but does that matter? Does that factor into your calculations as to how happy people are who are trying to hang on to these jobs?
In my world, sadly, no. To be candid, however, we all know a happy workforce tends to work better, right? And a workforce that feels valued and empowered tends to work better. But in my world, it's simply, sadly, dollars and cents. So it does not come up a lot.
But what would help is if people knew it's going to stop here or there, or I can see an end to this. We were seeing a lot of optimism coming up about vaccines. Question is how quickly will everybody have that? At least in terms of aerospace, from all the signs you can read, are we sort of done with it?
I wish I could be optimistic about this, but frankly, the best leader aviation has seen, one of the best leaders, one of the top 2 or 3 was Herb Kelleher at Southwest, who of course addressed this issue when he said, no, don't do this backwards. You look after your people look after your customers. That'll take care of your share price. The approach, I think, at Boeing for many years, and maybe to a lesser extent today, but certainly a lot of damage was done over the last decade, was doing the exact opposite of what Herb Kelleher said to do. Focus on the share price. The rest we don't have to worry about.
So one point that I would want to make, and actually this is a question I'll pose to Kevin, if I can, Glenn, if that's okay, is with all the cutbacks in the industry, one of my fears is when this does pass, and this will pass, will the supply chain and will the OEs be in a situation to deal with the ramp up, the inevitable ramp up that is coming, and the timing that's uncertain, like we've talked about, but it's there, it's going to happen. It's a matter of when, not if. Will they have cut too deep? And that's one of my worries.
Yeah, and we haven't really talked too much about the smaller suppliers and what we call tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers. Some of you on the call, many in the Pacific Northwest, but also suppliers in places like Wichita, Dallas, Fort Worth, other parts of the country that are supplying Boeing. What happens if they can't deliver when Boeing starts ramping up again when we get to the other side? And it's very hard to get one's arm around it. We're doing a survey right now of a global, a regional survey of suppliers and how many are under duress. By some estimates, 10 to 20% of the small suppliers could disappear or be consolidated or fail over the next year to year and a half. And it's a big deal. As we learned with the Fukushima disaster in Japan, when we lost an automotive paint, a supplier that made an element that went in an automotive paint, it shut down production lines 10,000 miles away. We've got to certainly watch out for that. But there's going to be a lot of turmoil in the sub-tiers of the supply chain, given this whole act that's gone on the last 7 or 8 years that I talked about earlier, with partnering for success and everything else. Boeing needs its suppliers. And if there's one thing Boeing could do to help its supply chain, and I know, Ron, you may not like this idea, you may like it, but look, if Boeing were to change its payment terms from 90 days or more to 60 days or fewer, I think that would go a long way towards helping these small suppliers. And Boeing will tell you that, no, we don't apply that to smaller suppliers. We only do that for bigger, but no, it cascades down because a lot of them are selling to tier 1s. And that would go a long way towards helping some of these suppliers get through this. Yes, Boeing would take a hit financially a little bit with working capital, but your small suppliers can't be your bank. It just doesn't work that way if you want them to be around for the long run. And Richard talked about defense. Right now, Lockheed Martin, its standard payment terms are 30 days. And if you're a small supplier, its standard payment terms are 15 days. And the Pentagon is so concerned about what could happen to our supply chain. They see the crossover that they have been urging the primes in defense to try and get more money out to its chain. So I know that isn't the financially optimal thing in this world we're in right now, but I think it's about finding that balance between your power as an aircraft OEM and preserving your supply chain, and especially your small suppliers that make it all work.
So I'm going to try to sum things up here, and I want to go to a question from Scott Hamilton, because it seems like everybody's talking about the next thing that needs to happen is this middle market airplane, whatever we're going to call it. I know NMA is dead, but there's going to be something. He says, none of the speakers indicated precisely what kind of airplane needs to produce: single aisle, twin aisle, how many seats, in 2 classes or not, what kind of range, and the timing for launch. We've addressed some of this so far, but since this is such a big deal, I wonder if you can put a finer point onto that.
I think we did. It's a 757 class plane with new everything, but it's 757 class. So somewhere between 210 and 240, ideally doing a bit better than the 4750 nautical miles, definitely single aisle, that 4750 nautical miles being the 321 neo XLR. So let's get it up with, let's use 40,000 pound thrust engines to get it to 5,500 nautical miles. That should be doable on my back of envelope math. And, between 210 and 240 seats. And I think you got a war winner. That's my rough view. Feel free to disagree, guys.
Ron, you studied this. What do you
Yeah.
think, Ron? You've studied this as much as anyone.
Yeah, so we've looked at this a lot, and there's a chart that we pull together that kind of really makes you see it. So we did it in several different years. You go back to 2018, and if you plot every flight that happened in the world by numbers of seats versus distance of flight, you can see all of a sudden there's this area where there's airplanes that are very, very capable flying shorter routes. Or if you could have airplanes that were less capable, just a little bit more capable, they could cover those routes. And that truly is the middle of the market. Our estimate when we last looked at this, and this was 2018, was that market was at least for maybe about 3,000 to 4,000 airplanes over a 20-year period. So it's a real market, I think. Per Richard's comments, it's really how can you make the economics of it work? And it really does seem like you want to go from the bottom up, not from the top down, which should suggest that you want a narrow body, probably with composite wing, with reasonably modern engine technology, reasonably the technology in the engines, and you can pull it together. And ultimately, what that ends up being is a modern analogy to a 7.5. That's maybe not as powered and maybe a little more efficient to put together.
Yeah, and when you go to a single aisle, the imperative for composites kind of it loses its luster if you go circular. So you could potentially make this thing metal, which is less expensive, but please, not the same cross section as the 737. The 737 is what, 18 or 20 inches narrower than the A320, but the average American's derriere has expanded considerably since the 1950s, and you actually notice a difference when you're on an A320. So even if they could give us another 18 inches so we can keep growing, it'd be good.
All right, let me wrap this up here. We're down to our last 3 minutes, and I want to talk about the future, which the pandemic has brought us. We are having this meeting on a Zoom call, and there's something like at least 500 people at last count who are out there watching this. If we were to do this in 2019, before anybody heard of COVID-19, all of us would have bought airline tickets, except for me, because I live here, hotel rooms. It would have been in a convention center. Meals would have been bought. I know people want to get together, but is the future on Zoom? Is it back to what it was, or is it a hybrid of both?
I don't have any doubt. I mean, I join Ron in this saying we're coming back. I really don't. And the reason is simple, for me at least, which is that we all compete with somebody. Unless you've got a job in an office somewhere and, I don't know, a government agency, you don't have to compete with anyone ever. Most of us compete either as a company or as a person. And if you have an opportunity to take business because you travel, you travel. And if your competitor doesn't, he loses it. Kevin is one of my best friends to a certain extent. We also compete. If he travels and I don't, she should take that business. That's the way the world functions. It's all very fun to say you're not going to travel and you're going to save on budgets when everyone is doing exactly the same thing. But when all of your friends and competitors are traveling and you're not, your career takes a serious hit, or the company you work for takes a serious hit. I think it'll all kick in when we're all on a playing field traveling again.
And Glenn,
Ron, you had said,
that point,
I want to go back to Ron first, because he did reflect on, he thinks that the recovery is going to come with business travel. So sounds like this theory may not hold up.
So, well, no, I mean, how do I say? I agree with Richard. I mean, I'm a believer in business travel. However, maybe, and this is a more refined view that's kind of formulated more recently, there are some businesses where travel isn't as essential. And in those businesses, maybe it ends up being more of a hybrid model. And the only reason I say that, for example, in my own business, we've been extraordinarily productive and we haven't traveled as much. Now, for me not to travel, that's not a tenable thing when my competitors are traveling. But there are businesses where that's probably, you don't have to travel as much. So I see a world where those that have to travel will, for sure, for all the reasons Richard said, that arbitrage, it just will close immediately. But there are some roles where maybe you don't have to. You can do it over a Zoom meeting. And ultimately, I do see a world that's skewed towards travel, but is hybrid, that Zoom or whatever will have a little more piece of it. Where, so for example, with this meeting, exactly, like if we were to do this again in 2 years, would we all travel? I don't know. Or would we do it Zoom? I mean, we'll see, because people will be balancing schedules, will be balancing other travel. I think sadly, the reality is we're all going to be more busy because we're going to be traveling and we're going to be Zooming. So we'll be doing, twice as much work.
Right, even more work.
The reality.
So Kevin, we're sort of over time, but this is the miracle of Zoom, so you can keep going, I guess. My apologies to TBW, but let me have you make your point, and I think you're going to have to wrap it up.
Oh, sure. Yeah, just one quick point to add on to this. If you take business travel, if you divide it into two groups, customer-facing conferences, that sort of thing, and intra-company travel. And this is where we're really lacking a lot of data, but it looks like somewhere between 15 and 35% of business travel is intra-company travel. So it could be Ron going to his London office, for example. And I think it's that intra-company piece of travel, which is between 15 and 35%, that we need to watch, because we know each other. We have a common community, a common culture. And that's where you can see something like Zoom potentially replace getting on an airplane for some of your meetings. But when it comes to customers and you're competing, to Richard's point, there's no substitute. So I think that's what we really need to watch. And I know Boeing really worried about video conferencing 15 and 20 years ago. That was the next big threat. And the study work that's been done on that suggests that where it made an impact is within companies, not between companies and not between suppliers and customers.
All right. Gentlemen, I got to call it here. It's been a great hour and a half. I think we've covered a lot of ground. Obviously, we couldn't get to everybody's questions, but some of them hit on some of these same topics. Again, I appreciate it. Again, thanks to IAM District 751 for providing the platform for this. Hopefully, everybody has something they can take away from this. Good night.